Actually, excellent morning, magnificent afternoon, and extremely wonderful evening, depending where you are in the world and watching this video. You could be doing it on replay or you could be doing it directly now. Doesn't matter to me, just watch it. Anyway, this is Carla from Rehan Alawala's World of Connections. And I am here to speak with Michael Strong, who has started an amazing online school using the Socratic method. And we're going to talk about the importance of English, but we're also going to talk about his school and what his school has to offer. And I'm extremely excited about this. So guys, give us a moment and you're going to hear from Michael. Remember, this show, like all of my shows, is sponsored by Rehan Alawala's Institute of Peace, which is an online organization promoting peace one conversation at a time. Michael, man of the hour, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I love to think and talk. I am the author of a book called The Habit of Thought, From Socratic Seminars to Socratic Practice. I'm also the author of a book, Be the Solution, How Entrepreneurs and Conscious Capitalists Can Solve All the World's Problems. And for 30 some years, I've mostly focused on creating schools that use the Socratic practice extensively. And most recently, as you mentioned, my online school, the Socratic Experience, for students grades 3 through 12.
Okay. Now, what was your inspiration to start this school?
Sure. So a couple of things. The big picture, going back to, I simply love thinking and discussing ideas. I left Harvard when I was 18. I had gone to Harvard as an undergraduate, and then I left to attend St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where for 4 years we discuss ideas. We read and discuss ideas, and I found that to be so much better than lecturing. And so that's why all of my schools have been based on intellectual dialogue, because I personally found it so valuable. And most students I've found find it much more engaging than being talked at. And then most recently, this one, when COVID hit, I'd spent my whole life doing brick and mortar schools. A lot of people were talking about how terrible virtual education was. And my perception is that if you're being lectured at, yes, virtual education is terrible, but conversation actually does pretty well online. So insofar as our core experience is conversation, that made for a really wonderful virtual school. And it's liberating as well, because we have students and faculty from around the world, and we have amazing human beings. I love Rehan's thing, peace one conversation at a time. We have people from around the world engaged in conversations all day, every day at school.
So are you saying that your school is more conversation than book and the boring books?
Exactly. So to talk a little bit about our humanities segment, so for 2 hours every day, all secondary students have 2 hours of humanities. The first part of that is simply community. One of the things we realized is for a virtual school to work well, the kids need to have time to talk to each other. And so there's no academic agenda. They can laugh and joke and have fun and connection time. And we believe explicitly that's valuable. Then we have another portion we describe as personal growth. That's an open-ended question about how to set goals, how to be your best self, how to deal with anger, when should you lie? All kinds of things. Am I playing too many video games? Whatever it is, we have conversations about life. Then we take a break, and then the Socratic itself, we read something difficult. And so we're training the students to read much more difficult material than they would on their own. The motivation for reading is to talk about it. Because if you come to class and you didn't read the reading, then you're kind of lost in the conversation. And so although the core experience is conversation, we're reading very challenging pieces of writing in philosophy, literature, poetry, anthropology, psychology, all over the place, because we want to introduce kids to the world of ideas and thinking and talking about ideas. We also do some Socratics in science. We have some electives that are partially conversational. We have some games in math sometimes. So math and science are not as strictly conversational, but the substance of much of our program is conversation.
That sounds great. One of the things that kind of bothers me in the schools today is that we do not teach to the needs of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
We teach for the test.
Yeah.
And actually, that was one reason when I retired, I agreed to retire because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did you set it up? Because you do teach math and you do teach science and you do teach English as not only a first language, but also a second language, knowing that you have people from all around the world. How do you handle that?
So first, people who do have very weak English, sometimes they do need to get additional tutoring or support. Occasionally we have a few students like that, but most of our students are already fluent enough that they can listen and engage. And the Socratic really is what we do for English class. So instead of traditional English class, for me, I believe reading, the goal of English class should be to read, speak, listen, think, write. And one of the best ways to learn how to speak more articulately is to read about complex ideas and then to have to explain them back and forth. And so a lot of what our students do is they develop the skill of reading by reading difficult material. They develop the skill of speaking by talking about complex ideas. And they develop writing. Obviously, we coach writing in various ways, and we do have some lessons in writing. But a lot of the writing is, if you and I had a conversation and you come away really passionate about something, then you're motivated to write about it. And when you write about it, then we can help you organize it into a thesis, essay format, a thesis, supporting paragraph, and so forth, and a conclusion. But the first thing is you have to have something you want to say. And most kids like writing stories. Most kids hate writing essays because they really don't have something to say. So I'll give you a concrete example. Last year, we read 2 essays on bringing the woolly mammoths back from extinction. It turns out we have the technology to bring the woolly mammoths back from extinction. We read 2 articles, one saying we should because of A, B, and C, another saying no, we shouldn't because of X, Y, and Z. The kids argue about it. They have very strong opinions. Some think that would be so cool. Others, no, that would be horrible. Whatever they believe, we let them argue and debate it. And then at the end, okay, what do you think and why? And, as you know, a long-standing English teacher, a thesis statement is what do I believe and why? And then it's a matter of organizing the structure after that. So it's a very quick, high-level description of how we the reading, the writing, the speaking, the listening are the core experiences of our English class.
And that's what education is about, to encourage the child to be, or the student, not even a child all the time, to find out who he or she is. Now, do you work on that with the kids?
I would say the actual secondary curriculum is the conscious development of personal identity, which is a very big mouthful. But for me, the core Socratic experience is what is true, what is good, and what is noble. And so whatever we're talking about, when we're talking about in personal growth, what goals will you set? Well, is that a worthwhile goal or not? When you're talking about how do you deal with anger? When should I be angry? When shouldn't I be angry? Why? What is my relationship to anger? That's figuring out who you are. When we're talking about, a theory of justice, what do I think is just? What do you think is just? Why do we have different ideas of justice? And each of us comes to our own understanding of what justice is. So Socrates described himself as a midwife, and it's not about his ideas and it's not about our ideas as guides. We're midwives to help each student kind of give birth to their own ideas and ultimately their own identity about what is important in life.
I love it. I want to go back to school and teach now. Is it Now it is completely online at this point. Have you thought about putting it into an actual building also?
Well, I've spent my whole life doing actual building schools, and frankly, it is so much easier online. Part of this is, obviously, we don't have to deal with a facility. And, there are all sorts of issues with groups of teenagers in person that are challenging. Also, the faculty are limited. Faculty and students are located to one geography. So I love actual brick and mortar school communities. And at this point, I'm really excited to be doing this virtually and pulling people together from around the world. So at this point, we might do something down the road, 5 to 10 years in person, but at this point, I'm just loving the virtual thing, actually.
What is it about the virtual thing that you love most?
Well, I would say what aspect is we really get a lot of aligned families. It's kind of amazing. We have families, who we have in Pakistan. We have
Oh, yeah.
families in Panama and Canada. We have got guides in Mexico and Turkey and Eswatini. We've had families from London and Egypt and Oman. So we're incredibly global. And it really is, but everybody comes to this because they want to take initiative. They want to have their own vision for their life. So I think we're able to create an extremely interesting community online that we just couldn't replicate in one local region.
Absolutely. And for the younger kids, how does this work?
Oh, that's a really good question. So first of all, we started grade 3 simply because very young children, we don't think it's appropriate to have them on the computers. Starting in middle school at grade 6, they do have an hour at a time. Our classes are basically an hour length. But grades 3, 4, and 5, it really is different. And most of our guides, our lead guides in the elementary program are Montessori trained. And while it can't be explicitly Montessori online, it's inspired by Montessori. And so one of the things we do is a lot of the lessons are much shorter. So instead of an hour, we'll have small pull-out group lessons of 15 to 20 minutes, occasionally 30 minutes. We also have a lot of student-driven projects. So we also do that at the secondary level, but instead of the guides teaching science, for instance, in the elementary, the students are really excited about studying giraffes or grasshoppers or whales or whatever. And so they all go and research, and then they come back and they give presentations. And so insofar as the students are giving presentations and listening to each other's presentations, they love it. They're really excited. They're just full of energy and all want to show off to their peers everything they're doing. And so, there's this kind of community where we do give little lessons in reading, writing, math in small pull-out groups. And then we have Socratic discussions, shorter. And then we have math games, shorter. And then we have this incredible, let's do things, let's share our projects together. And then in the afternoons, we have music, dance, theater, fun, creative things. And it's funny, it's surprising the extent to which you can feel the energy. You and I are both relatively, modest energy. The young ones are just boom, full of energy. It's like popcorn out there.
To say the least.
Exactly.
How many kids are in the lower grades?
So we've got about 30 in elementary, about 30 in middle school, and 30 in high school, and we're growing. So, we could easily be 40 at each level by the end of the year, maybe more. And then we break them up into smaller communities. So, we'll pull, we're right now dividing the elementary grades because getting towards 30 is too much for one. So we're going to pull it into two groups of 20, and then we'll continue to kind of divide into smaller communities as we grow.
And how many teachers do you have? So
it's in the upper grades, it's essentially 15 to 1. In the lower grades, we've got a few more, so it's a little bit closer to 10 to 1. And some of them are part-time, so it's kind of complicated in terms of full-time versus part-time.
Okay, I want a sample lesson. This excites me to know, no, I can't even say it. Because when I was in school and teaching, the last year I taught children who were educably mentally retarded, supposedly.
Yeah.
And what I found, because I had never taught that disability before, was it wasn't that they were missing much, they were not given the chance to learn. Like I had a little girl who hated to multiply, and by the end of the year, she was multiplying 3 digits by 2 digits. Unheard
Mhm.
of.
Yep.
Of course, she was using a times table, but I don't care. She
Right.
got it.
Yeah.
So it excites me. Can you give me a mini lesson?
Well, we actually, so I have weekly Socratic dialogues. I have a YouTube channel called Socratic Michael Strong, and there we recently, I've got a group of younger children, so 9, 10, 11 kind of thing. And there today we read a poem by Pablo Neruda on the death of a dog. And so one of the things that came up is there a separate dog heaven? And we'll start there. So do you think there's a separate dog heaven, or do dogs go to our heaven, or do they not have a heaven, or how would we even decide such a thing?
I think that heaven is heaven for everyone, and that the dogs and the cats and all those animals just meet their owners again and grow again.
Well, it's interesting. In Neruda's poem, it turns out that he thinks the dogs have a heaven and we don't. And part of his sadness is that the dogs, or part of their heaven would be to be reunited with their masters. But if they have a separate heaven, they would not be reunited with their masters. So there's this sort of sadness. I'm realizing that without having the poem in front of us, it's a little bit tricky. But you can see how even children, even 9-year-old children, sort of think through the logic of, if there's a separate dog heaven and a separate human heaven, then the dogs and humans don't get to be together. And that's the whole point. As the dogs want to be with their masters. And so part of what I do is I bounce off different ideas, both from the poem and from other people, and get them to kind of compare. So usually it is helpful to have a text where we can focus on, say, Neruda's words, and or other people with different opinions, because my role is simply to ask questions and get the conversation going and getting people to reflect on what they're doing. I would agree that it makes sense intuitively. The whole point is to be together. And I was so struck by the children really not liking the fact that Neruda's dog heaven didn't allow people there for that reason.
Now, if there was a separate dog heaven and a cat heaven and a whatever heaven, then what happened to the unity that brings us together by our breath? I mean, I don't care if you're a dog or a cat, we still share the same air. We still share the same thing that keeps us alive. Even in plants, they need the oxygen. The grass needs oxygen. So explain to me.
So again, my role is not to explain, but I'll tell you what Neruda said. Neruda said that he was a materialist, and so he didn't believe in other options. But then the kids, are wondering, yeah, how do we think about heaven? If there were to be heaven, and on your version where everything that breathes, does that mean we've got sort of an identical replica somewhere else with grass and dogs and trees and cats? Is that, do you envision sort of a completely separate realm that's identical to this one, but then it would include all the bad things? Or is it identical except without the bad things? How do you make that work?
Well, when we say something is bad or good, that's our own judgment.
So maybe,
go on.
I was going to say, so maybe in heaven it is exactly like this, but we're no longer frustrated by death and war.
maybe because it's the vibrations going through the universe, we would not be as involved with that happening.
Well, the question that comes to mind for me then is, presumably Rihan's interest in peace is because there's an evaluation that peace is better than violence. And so how do you reconcile working on behalf of peace if ultimately you think it doesn't matter in the long run?
Can we say it doesn't matter, or can we say that peace is here, but it's actually in our own mind that creates the peace or the war?
We can say that, but the question that would come to mind for me is, if you say that, does that mean you don't care if a child is killed? Because it's just in your own mind.
Interesting question. I do care if a child is killed.
Of course. But then how can you say it's only in your mind that it's bad?
Because we don't know all the circumstances that led up to that. And it could have been due to past karma in past lives.
Got it. So again, if we had a whole group of people, including young people, if you had a group of either children or teenagers, I think they would have lots of questions for you in terms of how all of this is supposed to work. Because I think often one of the goals of Socratic discussion, I would say, is to help people think through tensions in our lives and tensions in our beliefs. And of course, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to kind of a Buddhist and or Stoic perspective on accepting the pain of the world. And on the other hand, I'm of course also sympathetic to let's reduce the pain as much as possible, the suffering. And I think those are in a tension at a minimum. Because if one becomes sort of too accepting, one version is that we should be so accepting that we let all bad things happen. But I know that that's not where you are. And so then how do we reconcile the notion that we should be at peace with the universe while we should also presumably be motivated to stop bad things from happening?
You're a tough cookie.
Well, and what's beautiful, thank you, I'll take that as a compliment. What's beautiful is that even children, even young children, understand these things and they want to think about it. The other thing is, while in some sense it is putting people on the spot, what I find is that kids feel taken seriously when you ask them these questions and expect them to learn how to be consistent. They take them seriously, and also they're very interested in hearing what their peers think about important questions. I think these questions are important, and I think sometimes school comes across as disconnected from life. Whereas if you're talking about, should I work towards reducing the suffering in the world or not? And if so, how much? And sometimes kids are overwhelmed by the suffering of the world, as well we all could be. And so I think these sorts of moral tensions, psychological tensions, spiritual tensions, however you want to talk about them, logical tensions, I think these things are important. And so going back to identity, I think people gradually develop their identities of, I think all of us, if we have any heart at all, we're overwhelmed by the suffering of the world, but we can't live in that suffering all of the time. And so I think every human being has to come to a place individually and within their community with respect to how am I addressing the suffering and how am I also living my life? I think I don't want, most people don't want anybody to kind of sacrifice their life on behalf of the suffering of the world. So how does one kind of strike that balance? Very much part of the conscious development of personal identity.
I think it takes a lot of introspection, but I have to admit, I have been listening to a lot of Abraham Hicks recently, because I felt my mindset needed some tweaking. And what he says, sorry, what he says is the contrast of negative and positivity helps you know what you want and what you don't want. And if you're aware of what you don't want, you're going to focus more on what you do want.
Yeah.
So how can we help our children or anyone help them realize that they can shift their mindset just based on contrast, knowing, do I want that? No, I want this, focus on this.
Great question. And I would say what we're doing in these Socratic dialogues is a form of experiential learning. And so when the children listen to, should we bring the woolly mammoth back from extinction or not? And they listen to, do I want to do that? Do I not want to do that? When they listen to, is there a separate dog heaven or not? What do I think? What do I not think? When they listen to, should I accept the suffering of the world or should I not accept the suffering of the world? Every time somebody speaks in the group, and again, peer communities are the most important thing for young people. When they listen to their peers coming up with perspectives, I envision on a moment by moment basis, each individual child thinking about, yeah, where do I stand on each of these and 1,000 other issues? And I see that as developing strength in terms of what you said, by hearing about they don't want. Maybe I don't want to bring the woolly mammoths back. Maybe I don't think there's a separate dog heaven. Maybe I do want to be committed to relieving suffering in the world. Whatever it is, whatever position they take, I would say they are formed, and their direction with respect to their identity is formed by both accepting some of what others say and disagreeing with other things that others say. So gradually they develop their own very personal integration of who they are and what they stand for.
Okay, so in that case, we are teaching the children to know who they are. In regular education, and maybe I'm just in the mood to bash it at all, this doesn't happen at all. And I got many times into trouble because of my weird thinking, which I think is very normal. What do you think can be done in the educational systems to make education be what education should be?
So great question. And first, going back to know thyself, Socrates famously said, know thyself. So self-knowledge is the essence of education.
Right.
And I think ultimately we have to separate education from the state as much as possible. Because from the top down, all of the learning standards and all of this, the more closely one has to follow it, the less time one has for exploration. And you and I are both old enough to remember, I think 30 years ago, public schools were not so top-down controlled. But the whole standards movement has driven things in a direction where now in every state, there are detailed standards that are telling teachers exactly what they're supposed to teach, and often even how they're supposed to teach it. And this top-down dictation kind of eliminates, or mostly eliminates, a lot of personal discovery, which I think is the heart and soul of education.
And I agree with that. How can we make this education revolution begin?
Great question. So certainly part of it in the United States, and this is a global movement, but of course I'm more US focused, is there is a school choice movement in the US, and just 2021 was the best year ever. So in terms of allowing for the funding to follow the child, before 2021, there were programs in a number of states that allowed funding to follow the child such that 600,000 students could be outside the system. In 2021 alone, they added about 1.5 million additional opportunities for funding to follow the students. So just as of last year, it's about over 2 million students now have the freedom to escape the system with funding. Obviously, parents who can afford to do this can come to a school like mine with their own funding. We also provide some scholarships, but I'm very excited about allowing funding follow the child and letting parents and children decide what they want. And I think a lot of them will want much more meaningful education.
Because right now, I mean, you wouldn't believe what I went through in my last year, but everything I did, which was out of the box, because I had to be out of the box for my students, was squashed.
Well,
And
yeah, no, I remember joking with teachers that the teachers of the year, the greatest teachers in our society are typically the ones that break the rules all the time. If they weren't so great, they would probably get fired. But I think in order,
I did.
there we go, there we go. Well, I don't know if you know John Taylor Gatto. Do you know about Gatto?
I've heard
G-A-T-T-O?
the name. Tell me.
Oh, you have to read his work. There's his most famous piece, and I'll send it to you in Messenger, is 7 Lesson School Teacher. He was twice named New York City Teacher of the Year, and then he was named New York State Teacher of the Year. And in his acceptance speech for Teacher of the Year, he gave this wonderful speech, the basis of 7 Lesson School Teacher, and basically that the medium is the message in schooling, that schooling teaches emotional dependency, it teaches intellectual dependency. He basically describes it as 13 years of training in how to be passive and dependent. And that's exactly where I am. I think it's most, obviously some kids flourish despite the system, some teachers flourish despite the system, but 2/3 of American high school students are disengaged. 75% of American high school students are unhappy. I think it's about 20% are seriously considered suicide. It's a catastrophe. Yeah, the system is a catastrophe. And what people don't realize is it's all this top-down control, which was well-intentioned. People thought, oh, we need to have high standards. It's coming from a good place. But what it does is it's crushing the soul out of education.
And that is very troublesome.
Very troublesome.
When I took that last teaching assignment, there's craziness going with it. But when I took it because, oh, this is a new challenge, a new way of getting through to children.
Yeah.
And what actually happened was everything in that room came from my pocket. And it came from my pocket because I was supposed to use textbooks and instructional materials for kids 6th, 7th, and 8th grade who could barely read at a 2nd grade level. And some couldn't even do that.
Yeah.
And if they can't read it and they can't write it, they're not going to understand what I read to them.
Yeah. And I imagine when you first started teaching, you had a lot more freedom with respect to what you did and how you did it.
I always was in trouble.
Good for you. Good for you.
My parents never understood, but I was.
Well, and you probably know a lot of the great entrepreneurs didn't like and didn't do well in school. Richard Branson is a high school dropout. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, John Mackey of Whole Foods, they're all college dropouts. And so I think a lot of the people, and creators too, a lot of great creative talents did not like school. And so a lot of our great creators and entrepreneurs, some of whom might have learning differences, go off and do amazing things in the world, but did poorly at school. It's just not a good fit for a significant percentage of children.
And they don't realize it.
Yeah. Well, and they blame the child. The child, I know so many children who feel stupid because it's not a good fit. And I think it's very much, it's not them, it's not the child, it's the system. And, right. I'm very enthusiastic about all the people that are trying to change the system. But the first step is to realize it's broken and realize that we need to create education. I like talking about that our obligation as parents and educators is to discover and develop the genius in every child. And, I've known children who maybe had very low academic abilities, but were brilliant at photography or animation or graphic design. Again, you can be a brilliant creator without, having certain kind of academic skills. Also, I've actually known a lot of entrepreneurs who, again, did very poorly at school. Some of them, I'm working with somebody who was a high school dropout. He's now head of the Expat Money Show. So he actually was a middle school dropout. He dropped out in middle school, and now he is one of the world's leading experts on helping expats move around the world as a successful entrepreneur. And he and I are creating the Expat International School to support expat families who want their kids to be entrepreneurial and creative.
And that's so very, very important.
Well, it is. And again, I mentioned, I think before we started recording, that for the last 20 years, I've mostly been in Austin and San Francisco. And they're very entrepreneurial places where people are starting up projects all the time. And I think those people realize that the old system is dying. Elon Musk created a school for his children, which was very alternative, project-based, no grades, because an entrepreneur of Elon Musk's caliber realizes traditional schooling does not suit most kids. And I think he had learning differences as a child, but clearly very successful.
I actually recently saw a video. It wasn't necessarily Elon Musk, but how we have taken out actually human values and what a child needs to learn to feel comfortable learning, because we don't teach any of that anymore.
Yeah, no, I regard public schooling as a catastrophe. It's just a catastrophe. And, there are lots and lots and lots of people working on the edges in all sorts of ways to change it. And we just need to liberate parents and children and educators to go form relationships where they can learn in ways that they see that are valuable. I think a lot of it is there are different opinions. I know some people who very much like the organization of school. There are some people that love the highly structured thing. They love the fact that you have to teach standards every day. There are people that are like that. And I'm not. I'm one of these people. I've got 50 browser tags going all the time and 20 projects. I'm sure if I was in school, they'd medicate me for ADHD because I just couldn't sit still through it all day, every day.
But that's another thing. Kids are getting medicated for things that maybe do not apply to them. I remember a young lady, I loved her dearly. She drove me crazy because she couldn't stay focused, but her parents put her on a medication. And, I said, all of a sudden she's so focused. And they admitted that they did it, and they knew that I argued about it. And I'm like, it may be good temporarily, but what will it be on the long run?
Yeah, there was a famous psychologist, I forget his name, who said the symptoms of ADHD are very similar to the symptoms of childhood. I think healthy children are energetic and going all over the place, and there's a certain sense in which that's what it means to be a child. I often think about the comedian Robin Williams. I once heard a description of him in the classroom, and that he would be on the desk, under the desk, around the desk. Exactly. He was such a physical comedian and such a ball of creative energy. Today I think they would dose him up with tons of medication, and he may never have become the great comedian and human being that he was.
Or maybe they did, and he got so determined not to do it that they had to take him out of school. I remember having a young boy in my classroom, and this was about 30 years ago, and he would just jump on the table. And I was like, what do I do when he's on the table? I never really knew what to do. But at the same time, I spoke to the principal, and we figured out that something needed to be done, but not what, but didn't know what. And he never really settled down.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the biggest pain in the neck for me at the time. And I was a rather new teacher. I didn't know what to do or how. I was just learning how to flow with the child.
Yeah.
And I felt like the child needed so much more than I could give to him
Yeah.
because I had 5 other kids in that room.
Yeah.
And they didn't need him jumping on the
Yeah.
table.
Yeah. No, first of all, I think different kids need different schools, and I think we need lots and lots of different kinds of schools. But I remember once I was working at a Montessori middle school, and we had a vegetable garden outside, and we had, often boys that had so much physical energy. And sometimes we just have them, when they had all this energy, go dig a hole in the garden. And, just digging with a shovel and getting physically exhausted really helped. And after, getting all hot and sweaty and digging a hole in the garden, then they'd come back in and then they'd be ready to focus. And again, I think it's sort of like, I think it's cruel to own a big dog if you live in a small city apartment building, because they just have so much energy. I think it's cruel to have these energetic young people, forced into school all day. At a minimum, we need some schools for those very physical, often boys, where they spend a lot more time outside being physical.
I agree.
And then they come back in and then they can focus on their math. Hurrah.
Yeah. And maybe math isn't the thing that they need.
Yeah.
Maybe what they need is that physical activity. And
Yeah.
from that physical activity, they may come back and be the people reading Shakespeare and putting on those plays,
Yeah.
because that resonates with them and we don't know it.
And a lot of times they like to build, and so they could go outside and they could build all kinds of things. And we need people who are builders in our society. So yeah, I'm very passionate about radical diversity and approaches to education, and giving parents, teachers, and educators pretty much absolute freedom to explore what's right for every child.
And that's what is needed when you talk about education.
Big time.
Having said that, I have kept you much longer than we had agreed upon. So do you have any final words that you really want to leave our audience with?
I would say if your child is not thriving, or if you as a child are not thriving in school, I would say do everything you can to find an environment where you are thriving or where your child can thrive. Don't let the system tell you you're wrong. I think the system is almost always in the wrong. And let's work together to create a system, or 1,000 systems, 10,000 systems. Let's work together to create radical diversity in education that works for everyone.
Thank you so very, very, very much, Michael. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Carla, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Oh, we're going to talk about that later. I want to thank everyone who has watched and remind you that this show is sponsored by the Institute of Peace, which is an online organization promoting peace one conversation at a time. And Michael, can we just wave goodbye?
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Great to meet you all. I do have to go.